Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far more unsettling than plagues or punishments. Because the very bread sitting on your medieval table, the food you think will keep you alive, is laced with chalk, sawdust and sometimes even ground bones. And if that doesn't get you, the rye fungus will, twisting your body into convulsions and your mind into visions of demons. Forget castles and chivalry. This is the real Middle Ages, and you probably wouldn't survive a single bite. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these dives into history. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news? There's bread on the table. The bad news? That bread is a medieval crime scene. It looks normal enough, round, a little cracked, dusted with flour. But when you tear it open, the crumb puffs out a faint grey powder. That's not flour, that's chalk, and you're about to eat it because you're starving. See, in medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was survival itself. Peasants ate up to 2 pounds of it every single day, which means if something went wrong with the local bakery, an entire town could be doomed overnight. And things went wrong often. To make loaves look whiter and more expensive, bakers cut their flour with chalk, ground limestone, or even gypsum, the same stuff used in plaster walls. So if you've ever complained about modern bread being too processed, just remember, at least it's not doubling as drywall, and that was just the starter course. Some bakers bulked out their dough with sawdust, powdered beans, or bone dust scraped from old carcasses. Yes, bone dust. You bite into your loaf, expecting a chew, and instead you're crunching on someone's leftover femur. The medieval logic was simple. Stretch the flour, stretch the profit, and if you chipped a tooth, well, consider it extra calcium. But the real horror wasn't the filler, it was the fungus. Rye, the poor man's grain, was vulnerable to ergot, a black parasitic fungus that thrived in damp fields. Eat enough ergot bread and your body convulsed. Your skin burned as though it were on fire, and your mind fractured into hallucinatory visions. Whole villages twitched and screamed, convinced demons were crawling under their skin. You thought gluten intolerance was bad? Try the devil's bread. Of course, none of this stopped people from eating it, because bread wasn't optional. Famine years meant bakers threw anything they could find into their loaves: weeds, tree bark, acorns, and whatever else would hold together in the oven. The result was less a meal and more a survival brick. If you cracked a molar, at least it distracted you from your hunger pains. And this wasn't just personal misery. Bad bread triggered riots. Medieval towns had bread courts, and bread police tasked with punishing dishonest bakers. Get caught selling a loaf padded with chalk and you might be fined, shamed in the stocks, or forced to carry your fraudulent bread around town like a scarlet letter of gluten. But most bakers got away with it, because starving customers weren't picky, and inspectors were usually too busy eating the evidence. You glance down again at your loaf. The crust is cracked, the inside streaked with suspicious green flecks. You take a bite anyway, because hunger always wins. It crunches in your teeth like gravel, chalk dust coats your tongue, and suddenly your stomach feels like it's swallowed a cathedral wall. The marketplace hums around you, but in the back of your mind you wonder how long before your body decides to join the others convulsing in the street. And yet, this is just the beginning. Because if you think bread was the only medieval staple secretly poisoning people, wait until you see what they were pouring into their drinking water. And while you chew that chalky loaf and pretend it counts as dinner, you should probably know bread wasn't just the victim of bad ingredients. The entire system that produced it was stacked against you. Milling grain in the Middle Ages was less about feeding people, and more about squeezing every possible coin out of them. You walk down to the village mill, sack of rye slung over your shoulder, thinking you'll grind enough flour to keep your family alive. But the moment you arrive, you realise this isn't charity. The miller owns the wheel, the water rights, and somehow your soul. He takes a hefty cut of your grain as payment, and if he feels greedy, he takes a little more while pretending you just mismeasured. The French even had a word for it, a banalité, a feudal tax that forced peasants to use the lord's mill. You could not grind your own grain without breaking the law, which meant bread began with extortion before it even touched the oven. The mill itself is hardly trustworthy. Great wooden gears grind together with a noise like thunder, sending flour dust into the air until it cakes every beam. The dust hangs so thick it can ignite into fireballs if a spark appears, which is one reason medieval mills sometimes exploded. Imagine trudging into the village with your grain, only to watch the building that holds your food erupt into flames because someone sneezed near the grindstone. Survival was always one accident away from disaster. Once flour leaves the mill, it faces yet another obstacle, the guild system. In medieval cities, bakers were organised into powerful guilds that controlled how bread was made, sold and priced. On paper, this was supposed to ensure quality. In reality, it meant bakers often worked under strict regulations that encouraged them to cheat. A loaf could only be so heavy, so large, so cheap. But famine never followed regulations. To keep profits up, bakers shaved weight from loaves and padded out flour with whatever material they could get away with. Medieval London had inspectors called assize officers, who carried scales to weigh loaves. Get caught shortchanging customers and your punishment might be a fine, the stocks, or worse, being forced to carry your fraudulent bread through the streets while people jeered and pelted you with rotten vegetables. But inspectors were few, bribery was common, and hungry customers rarely complained too loudly when the alternative was no bread at all. In some cases, bakers faced punishments as absurd as their crimes. In parts of Germany, dishonest bakers were dunked into rivers in special cages called bakers' chairs. Too much chalk in the bread, and you found yourself bobbing up and down in icy water while the crowd laughed. In France, the standard humiliation was the pillory, where the accused stood chained beside their suspicious loaves, and in England there are records of bakers who baked their own punishment bread, massive loaves carried through town like parade floats of shame. Bread was both the crime and the evidence, held aloft as if to say, "Behold the plaster-filled sponge that nearly killed your children." But even honest bakers had no real control over what went into their bread. Grain storage was primitive at best. Your sacks of rye or wheat sat in damp barns, exposed to rats, insects, and mould. Rats left droppings, insects laid eggs, and mould sprouted like an unwanted garnish. A single spoiled sack could contaminate a whole batch of flour. Ergot, that dreaded fungus, often hid in these stores. It resembled small black grains that were easy to miss when mixed with rye. Bake it into bread and the results were catastrophic. Modern historians believe outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, where whole villages hallucinated and convulsed, were directly tied to these contaminated stores. In 944, a French epidemic killed some 40,000 people, all from bread baked with tainted rye. Imagine walking into your local bakery, buying a loaf, and discovering the entire town is twitching in the streets by nightfall. That was medieval life. The desperation to stretch flour only grew worse during famines. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe suffered what historians call the Great Famine. Torrential rains drowned crops, livestock died, and grain prices soared. People baked loaves with weeds, ground bark, or whatever edible scraps they could scavenge. Some accounts describe bread so dark and bitter it barely resembled food. Chroniclers wrote of loaves that caused diarrhea, vomiting, and fever, but people ate them anyway because starvation was worse. Modern nutritionists have compared these famine breads to eating a sponge soaked in sawdust, which, ironically, is not far from what they actually contained. For wealthier households, bread was slightly less horrifying, but still strange by modern standards. Lords and nobles often ate manche, a fine white bread made from the purest flour, a luxury so rare it was a symbol of status. The rest of society ate maslin bread, a mix of wheat and rye that came out dense and heavy. Then there was horse bread, made with beans, peas and oats, designed originally for animals but often eaten by the poor in hard times. If you were lucky enough to get horse bread, it meant you had at least something to chew, though you were essentially eating the same ration as the donkey tied up outside. You pick at your loaf again and notice something moving, a small beetle wriggling its way out of the crumb. Insects in flour were common, sometimes even considered part of the meal. Grinding them out entirely was nearly impossible, and since protein was scarce, no one complained too loudly. If it twitched on your tongue, you told yourself it was extra nutrition. Flour beetles, grain moth larvae, and the occasional rat dropping were all just seasoning in the medieval pantry. As if all this wasn't enough, bread also carried spiritual weight. The church regulated fasting days and often dictated when people could eat certain foods. Bread became a symbol of piety as much as sustenance. Yet behind the altar, the very loaves blessed for communion could be contaminated with the same filth as everyday bread. There are even records of churches locking their sacramental bread in cupboards to keep mice from devouring it before Mass. The holy body of Christ was apparently also a holy snack for rodents. Even the act of baking itself was a gauntlet of hazards. Ovens were communal in many towns, shared by entire neighbourhoods. You would line up with your lump of dough, hoping your loaf wouldn't get swapped, stolen or scorched. Wood-fired ovens had no timers, no neat temperature gauges, only roaring flames and guesswork. Burn it too hot and your loaf came out black and inedible. Too cool and it stayed doughy, a stomach-churning lump that guaranteed indigestion. Bakers worked long hours in stifling heat, inhaling smoke and flour dust until their lungs resembled old chimney walls. And yet, they kept baking, because without bread, towns collapsed into chaos. The more you think about it, the more you realise medieval bread wasn't food in the modern sense. It was a negotiation with death, a gamble that each bite wouldn't carry mould, poison or parasites. And you ate it anyway, every day, because hunger didn't care about risk. It wasn't about flavour, it wasn't about health. It was about survival. You chewed chalk, bones, bark and fungus, washed it down with ale, and prayed that this loaf wouldn't be the one that ended you. And still, bread was just the beginning of your medieval diet. Because when you wander away from the oven and toward the village market stalls, the horrors don't end. In fact, they only get stranger, with medieval meat sellers and fishmongers pulling tricks that make sawdust bread look almost wholesome. When soldiers marched to war, bread marched with them. An army was said to travel on its stomach, but in medieval Europe that stomach was mostly filled with stale, rock-hard loaves that could double as a weapon if you threw them. Bread was the core ration for troops, sometimes making up 3/4 of their daily calories. A knight might carry fine white manchet bread, while the rank and file chewed their way through maslin, the heavy rye and wheat mix that sat like a stone in the gut. And in desperate campaigns, soldiers received horse bread, the same coarse mix fed to their animals, proving that in war the line between man and beast blurred at the dinner table. The logistical nightmare of feeding armies with bread was enormous. Campaigns required hundreds of bakers to travel with troops, setting up makeshift ovens near encampments. These ovens were crude pits lined with clay, often baking loaves that came out half raw in the centre and scorched black on the outside. Soldiers were expected to eat it anyway, because hunger didn't wait for perfection. Chroniclers describe armies halting to bake bread, entire fields dotted with smoking clay domes as men waited for their rations. A single day's delay in baking could unravel a military plan. A hungry army was not just unhappy, it was mutinous. Spoilage was constant. Fresh bread went stale in days, so soldiers carried hardtack, the brick-like biscuit baked without yeast until it resembled petrified wood. Hardtack could last for months, sometimes years, though by the time you bit into it, worms and weevils usually had the first taste. Soldiers softened hardtack by soaking it in ale, or boiling it into a kind of bread soup. Accounts mention men breaking their teeth on the stuff, then dunking it into stew until it became edible sludge. And even then, you could find yourself crunching into a live weevil. Many soldiers joked, if you hold the biscuit still, the meat wiggles on its own. The quality of flour for soldiers was often the lowest available. Grain that was too mouldy, too worm-eaten, or too coarse for townspeople often found its way into military stores. Feeding soldiers wasn't about nutrition, it was about bulk. If a man could keep marching, the bread had done its job, but eating spoiled bread had consequences. Dysentery swept through camps, sometimes felling more soldiers than the enemy arrows. Imagine preparing for battle only to spend the night doubled over from a loaf that smelled faintly of mildew. In some campaigns, the bread killed more men than combat. Bakers in armies faced suspicion as much as trust. If a campaign went badly, soldiers blamed the bread. Rumours spread of bakers padding loaves with sawdust or flour cut with dirt. Punishments were swift. A dishonest baker might be flogged, exiled from camp, or even executed for treason, because bad bread was considered sabotage. Feeding men poison, even by accident, was seen as aiding the enemy. There are scattered records of bakers being hanged after armies fell sick, their only crime being careless storage or damp weather that spoiled the flour. And yet bread was also currency. Soldiers were sometimes paid in loaves rather than coin. Chroniclers mention troops trading bread for wine, armour repairs, or even women's company in occupied towns. To run out of bread was to run out of wealth. A soldier who guarded his loaf carefully might survive longer than one who squandered it. In siege warfare, bread became the ultimate prize. Cities under siege baked sawdust and straw into loaves, trying to stretch dwindling supplies. Defenders ate bread blackened by mould, even bread made with crushed animal bones. Starvation made everything fair game. A loaf of genuine flour bread was worth more than gold when the gates were locked. Siege accounts from the 100 Years' War describe soldiers gnawing on crusts so hard they had to be soaked in water overnight before they could be chewed. Some loaves became so rock-like they were used as building material for fortifications, stacked into walls as though they were bricks. In a way, bread turned into both food and architecture, blurring the line between survival and absurdity. You might eat your wall one night, then rebuild it with fresh loaves the next day. The symbolism of bread for soldiers was enormous. Victorious armies baked celebratory loaves, massive in size, carried through camp like trophies. The act of eating bread was proof of power, that supplies still flowed, that the army remained intact. Conversely, when bread ran out, panic set in. Mutinies often began with shortages, soldiers refusing to march on empty stomachs. Armies collapsed not from lack of weapons, but from lack of bread. Picture yourself as a medieval soldier, crouched by a campfire after a day's march. You pull out your ration loaf so stale it rings when you tap it against your helmet. You soften it in ale, only to see small white worms floating to the surface. You drink it anyway, because thirst beats disgust. Around you, hundreds of men chew in silence, jaws working like millstones, the crunch of bread worms part of the nightly symphony. Tomorrow you will march again, your body fueled not by strength, but by desperation. Even knights with privilege didn't escape the bread problem entirely. While they had finer loaves, often baked with white flour, long campaigns stripped even noble rations down to basics. A knight's manchet loaf might stay pure for a few weeks, but eventually it degraded into the same rock-hard lumps eaten by common soldiers. And because bread was baked communally in camp ovens, noble loaves often got mixed with the rest. Your rank might promise you softer crumbs, but war had a way of levelling out meals. The absurdity stretched into peace as well. After campaigns, soldiers returned home with habits shaped by army bread. Some chroniclers complain that veterans preferred coarse loaves even when better food was available, because they had grown used to chewing something dense enough to break teeth. Others returned with parasites picked up from years of contaminated rations. A loaf of bread, eaten daily, was both sustenance and infection, a reminder that survival was never clean. And as you finish gnawing the last stale chunk of your soldier's ration, the camp prepares for tomorrow. The bakers stoke fires, the millstones grind more grain, and the cycle continues. The bread will be ready at dawn, hard as stone, full of surprises and absolutely unavoidable. Which leaves only one question lingering as you crawl into your blanket, stomach cramping and jaw sore. If this was how soldiers ate, what exactly were the rulers feasting on while wars raged? And how different were their loaves from the chalk-filled bread of the common man? And while soldiers chewed their way through wormy rations on the march, nothing compared to what happened inside the walls of a besieged city. Bread was no longer just food, it became the dividing line between life and death. When armies surrounded a town and cut off its supplies, the ovens kept burning as long as there was anything, and I mean anything, to throw into the dough. What started as wheat or rye turned into weeds, crushed peas, ground acorns, and eventually shoe leather shaved thin and softened with water. Siege bread was the Frankenstein of medieval baking, stitched together from scraps of desperation. Medieval chroniclers recorded these horrors with a mix of pity and disbelief. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, residents mixed ground date pits and even sawdust into loaves. In the Great Siege of London in 1267, people were said to bake bread from ground beans and peas so bitter that they caused constant stomach pain. In the brutal siege of Rouen in 1418, bakers ran out of grain and made loaves with animal skins, horse bones, and straw. Imagine peeling the hide off a horse, grinding it into paste and calling it bread. Yet in starvation, nothing was off limits. The symbolism of bread in a siege was staggering. The ability to produce even the smallest loaf meant morale, meant survival, meant the enemy had not yet won. People lined up for crumbs, mothers broke loaves into tiny pieces to share among children, and rulers made public displays of distributing bread to prove their strength. When no bread appeared, riots often followed. The absence of loaves was like a silent announcement that death was near. Chroniclers describe crowds tearing apart bakeries, looting ovens, and even killing bakers suspected of hoarding flour. The science of survival bread was brutal on the body. Grinding acorns into flour introduced tannins that damaged the stomach. Bark loaves were almost impossible to digest, leading to vomiting and cramps. Bread made from straw passed through the body almost unchanged, offering no real nutrition. People survived not on calories but on hope, chewing loaves that filled the stomach but provided nothing else. Archaeological digs in old European cities have uncovered carbonized loaves from sieges, blackened lumps of grain mixed with bone fragments and straw. These were not rare accidents, they were standard siege rations. There were also darker rumours. In some of the most desperate blockades, people whispered of loaves that contained human remains. In 1573, during the Siege of Haarlem, the defenders supposedly baked bread from ground bones taken from graveyards. Chroniclers debated whether it was literal or exaggerated propaganda, but the symbolism stuck. Bread was the body of Christ in church, but in a siege it became the body of your neighbour in the oven. The phrase skeletons in your bread wasn't just a metaphor. Survival loaves also reflected social hierarchy. Nobles inside besieged castles often had access to finer hidden stores of flour. They ate white bread while peasants outside the walls of the keep gnawed on bark loaves. This inequality bred resentment, fueling uprisings within cities under siege. There are accounts of starving townsfolk storming castle pantries, dragging out fine loaves and holding them up in fury. Bread riots did not stop for walls, they erupted inside them, and bread was weaponized. During some sieges, attackers catapulted spoiled loaves into cities, hoping to spread disease or demoralize defenders. These loaves might be infested with mold or deliberately smeared with filth. To receive a loaf over the wall was not a blessing, it was an insult. One chronicler even wrote of besiegers baking loaves shaped like obscene symbols and hurling them into town, a psychological warfare tactic that mocked the starving defenders. The role of bakers in sieges was both honoured and cursed. They were essential for survival, but also the first blamed when supplies ran short. If flour disappeared, bakers were accused of theft or treason. Punishments were swift. Some were executed by mobs, others driven out of town, a bitter irony since they had been working with nothing more than bark and straw to begin with. Yet despite the hatred, their ovens kept burning until there was literally nothing left to burn. The impact of siege bread lasted far beyond the battles. Survivors carried memories of famine loaves for life. Chroniclers write of people decades later shuddering at the taste of acorns, remembering the misery of grinding them into flour. Some communities even held commemorations where loaves of famine bread were displayed, not to be eaten, but as reminders of suffering endured. These loaves became artifacts of trauma, symbols of endurance but also of humiliation. Imagine standing in the bakery of a besieged town. The oven is hot but the baskets are empty. The mill is silent, the grain stores bare. Someone brings a sack of straw and animal hides. You chop, grind and knead them into dough. The smell rising from the oven is sharp, acrid, more like burning hair than bread. The loaf emerges black, dense, smelling faintly of death. People line up anyway, hands outstretched, eyes hollow. They chew in silence, each bite another reminder that survival is costing them everything. And when the last crumbs are gone, when even the bark has been stripped from the trees, you look around at your city and realise the ovens have finally gone cold. For medieval people, that silence was often the true signal that the walls would soon fall. It is strange to think of bread as both the symbol of life and the herald of collapse. Yet for medieval Europe, every siege proved it. Bread was hope, bread was poison, bread was humiliation, bread was the final line of resistance. And as the ashes of the ovens cool, you begin to wonder what happened in places where bread was not merely stretched but outlawed altogether, where religious rules and superstitions dictated when you could eat it and when you could not. Bread was never just food, it was also faith. In medieval Europe, loaves sat at the crossroads of survival and salvation, both a meal for the body and a symbol for the soul. The Church claimed bread as sacred, declaring it the literal body of Christ in the Eucharist. Yet behind that holy symbolism was the same practical loaf that might be crawling with beetles or dusted with chalk. Imagine kneeling at the altar, mouth open, waiting to receive a fragment of the divine, only to bite into something that tastes like damp limestone. Even salvation came mixed with plaster. The sanctity of bread meant the Church controlled its production in more ways than one. Monasteries operated their own bakeries, producing loaves for both the monks and the poor. The rule of St. Benedict required monasteries to provide food to travellers, which often meant handing out bread. On feast days, special loaves were baked and distributed as alms, a tradition that gave rise to the idea of soul loaves, bread given for the sake of the dead in hopes it would shorten their time in purgatory. In practice, these alms often became a competition for who could get the largest chunk, with beggars fighting in churchyards over mouldy bread that was supposedly infused with divine grace. Holy bread could become dangerous in ways no one expected. Insects were a constant problem, and churches often kept their consecrated bread locked in cupboards to keep mice away. Yet rodents broke into them anyway, nibbling on the body of Christ as if it were no different from a granary sack. Priests recorded this as a spiritual scandal, but practically speaking, it was a sanitation issue. The holy loaf was still just bread, and the mice didn't care about theology. There are accounts of church councils debating what to do if vermin ate the Eucharist. Was the mouse guilty of blasphemy, or simply hungry? Medieval people genuinely wrestled with this question while their congregations starved outside. Superstition made bread even stranger. People believed loaves could heal illness, repel demons, or protect households from lightning. A priest's blessing supposedly transformed bread into a charm. Families kept blessed loaves on their shelves like holy talismans, nibbling at them during storms or fevers. But as these loaves aged, they grew mould, turning their miraculous crumbs into toxic little bombs of penicillium and aspergillus. Eating one might soothe your fears of demonic possession, but it could also give you convulsions. In a world without germ theory, it was easy to mistake food poisoning for divine punishment. Bread was also used in trial by ordeal. In the ordeal of the morsel, accused criminals were forced to eat a piece of consecrated bread. If they swallowed without choking, they were declared innocent. If they gagged, they were guilty. The problem was that nervous men often choked on dry bread regardless of guilt. Imagine being accused of theft, forced to chew a stale crust in front of the whole village, and condemned not because you stole, but because the loaf lodged in your throat. Justice was literally a matter of crumbs. The church also dictated when bread could or could not be eaten. Fasting seasons like Lent restricted diets, pushing people toward meagre loaves made with peas or beans. These substitute breads were often rougher, less nutritious, and more prone to spoiling. Yet they carried moral weight. Eating fine bread during Lent was a sin, even if it was the only food available. For medieval Christians, bread was not just survival, but moral judgment. Every bite carried the weight of eternity, whether it came from the altar or the bakery. Ceremonial loaves could be absurd in their extravagance. At coronations and festivals, kings commissioned enormous breads baked in elaborate shapes. Some were several feet across, gilded with gold leaf and stuffed with spices. Chroniclers describe loaves decorated like crowns, displayed as symbols of wealth. But the show did not erase the reality that common people were chewing on acorns and bark just beyond the palace walls. Bread was the sharpest contrast between privilege and poverty, holiness and hunger. Picture yourself in a medieval church, kneeling at the altar. A priest places a crumb of bread on your tongue, and for a moment you believe it will save your soul. But the taste is bitter, the texture rough, and you wonder if the same corruption that taints the marketplace has seeped into the sacred. Outside the church doors, beggars scramble for soul loaves, gnawing on bread so stale it could chip teeth. Above you, a mouse scurries across the rafters, carrying off another crumb of divinity. Bread connects everyone, yet divides them more than it unites. Even miracles were tainted by bread. Stories circulated of saints multiplying loaves to feed crowds, yet in practice these loaves were subject to the same mould and pests as any other. Pilgrims brought back miracle bread from shrines, keeping it as relics, but years later these relics had disintegrated into dust and weevils. What had once been proof of divine power became evidence of nature's indifference. In the end, bread reminded people that faith could inspire, but it could not change biology. And as you leave the church, your stomach still growling, you see the bakers' shops lined up along the street. Their ovens smoke, their stalls display loaves of every shape, but you cannot forget what you just swallowed. Holy or profane, miraculous or mundane, every loaf still hides the same dangers. And now your attention shifts to the bakers themselves. The men who built their livelihoods on this fragile balance between survival and poison, and the punishments they faced when bread went wrong. Step back out from the church and into the street, and you will find that the baker's shop is not just a place of commerce, it is a theatre of risk. For while the miller might cheat you quietly, the baker could be punished loudly. Bread was so essential to medieval survival that tampering with it was treated not as a minor crime but as an assault on society itself. A butcher might cut corners and get away with it, but a baker who lightened a loaf faced humiliation, violence, and sometimes death. Cities across Europe appointed inspectors to weigh loaves and test their quality. In England, this was the assize of bread and ale, a law that regulated not only how much a loaf should weigh, but what it should cost. Grain prices shifted constantly, so bakers had to adjust daily, a delicate balancing act that was nearly impossible to win. Too light, and you risked the stocks. Too heavy, and you lost money. Even honest bakers were at the mercy of inspectors with scales that were not always accurate. A loaf a few ounces shy could land you in prison, which meant that every baking day was a gamble with your livelihood. The punishments were designed to be spectacular. In France, corrupt bakers might be paraded through the streets with their fraudulent loaves strung around their necks. In Germany, a dishonest baker was dunked into rivers in special contraptions called baker's chairs, the crowd roaring with laughter as he flailed in the freezing water. In London, some were chained to pillories with loaves nailed to their heads as symbols of shame. There are even accounts of bakers being forced to bake their own punishment bread, oversized, ridiculous loaves carried on their backs as they marched through town. The bread became both the crime and the evidence, proof of their guilt displayed for all to see. The spectacle served a purpose. Bread riots were some of the most common urban uprisings in medieval Europe. When prices rose or supplies fell short, mobs stormed bakeries. To prevent rebellion, authorities made examples of bakers who cheated, turning their punishment into public entertainment. The sight of a baker dangling in a cage over the river reminded everyone that, at least in theory, someone was watching over their loaves. Yet the irony was clear. Most of the bread still contained chalk, sawdust or mould, and inspectors could not possibly monitor every oven. Justice was selective, and the hungry rarely cared whether it was fair. Even when bakers avoided fraud, they still lived precariously. Baking was hot, dangerous work. Ovens were massive stone chambers heated with roaring fires, the temperature guessed by sticking in a hand or watching how fast flour browned. A moment's miscalculation could burn the bread or collapse the oven wall. Flour dust filled the air, coating lungs until bakers coughed like old men by 30. Fires were constant hazards, and entire neighbourhoods burned when a bakery went up in flames. In Paris, bakeries were banned from parts of the city because of their reputation for igniting infernos. Owning an oven was as much a curse as it was a business. The guild system offered some protection, but also more rules. In many towns, bakers' guilds enforced strict apprenticeships, requiring years of training before one could open a shop. They dictated prices, loaf sizes, and even how bread should be shaped. On feast days, bakers were forced to provide free loaves for the poor, cutting into already thin profits. And when famine struck, guild leaders often hoarded flour to keep themselves supplied while apprentices and journeymen went hungry. The profession was less about dignity and more about endurance. Despite their low status, bakers were crucial for armies and rulers. Kings often requisitioned bakers during campaigns, forcing them to follow troops into war. A baker might find himself building ovens in muddy fields, baking hundreds of loaves a day under threat of punishment if he failed. Soldiers distrusted bakers, believing they might skimp on flour or deliberately spoil dough. In some armies, a baker caught cheating was executed on the spot for treason. To feed an army bad bread was no different than stabbing them in the back, and yet bakers endured. They rose before dawn, hauled sacks of flour heavier than themselves, inhaled smoke and dust, sweated over blistering ovens, and faced angry mobs if anything went wrong. Their job was to provide the one food nobody could live without, and to do it while knowing that failure might mean a dunking, a flogging, or worse. Bread was the cornerstone of society, but the men who baked it were treated more like scapegoats than saviours. Picture yourself as a medieval baker pulling a loaf from the oven. The crust looks golden, the weight feels right, but an inspector looms outside your shop. You place the loaf on the scale, and your heart sinks as it tips just shy of the required weight. Tomorrow you may be chained in the square, loaves tied around your neck as children throw rotten cabbage. You worked through the night, risked fire and ash, but the public sees only a thief, and still, the next day, you will rise and do it again, because without bread the city would collapse. The cycle of suspicion never ended. Bakers cheated because survival pushed them to it. Authorities punished them to appease the hungry, and the people rioted because their bellies were empty. In this system, no loaf was safe, no oven entirely honest, no baker entirely secure. Bread held society together, but it also threatened to tear it apart. And as you watch a baker drag through the street with loaves dangling from his neck, you cannot help but wonder how different life was for those who never had to set foot in a bakery at all. For nobles and rulers, bread was not a hazard but a luxury, their tables stacked with loaves gilded in gold while the poor gnawed on plaster. The crowd jeers as the baker is hauled away, loaves swinging from his neck like a grotesque necklace. But not far from that chaos sits another world entirely, where bread means privilege, not punishment. For the nobility of medieval Europe, loaves were not simply sustenance, they were symbols, gilded tokens of status that set them apart from the masses. A nobleman could declare his wealth not only with jewels or banners, but with the bread on his table. Where a peasant chewed a loaf of maslin dense enough to bruise the jaw, a lord broke into manchet, a delicate white bread so refined that it glowed like ivory against the grime of the hall. The difference began at the mill. The grain for noble bread was sifted again and again until it was almost free of bran. This meant less nutrition but more prestige, since whiteness was equated with purity. White bread became the edible version of silk, a status marker that you could chew. In England, the term manchet referred specifically to these fine loaves, small, round, and pale. They were baked in private ovens, guarded by household bakers whose job was to ensure that no trace of common flour touched the lord's loaf. To eat manchet was to remind your guests and servants that you stood above them, even at the dinner table. Extravagance went further during feasts. Chroniclers describe banquet tables groaning with loaves baked into elaborate shapes. Bread moulded into crowns, castles, and even animals appeared as centerpieces, only to be discarded once the feast ended. In some courts, loaves were gilded with real gold leaf, a shimmering crust that made the simplest staple into a display of absurd wealth. Guests might nibble on the edges, but most of these ornamental breads went untouched, eventually fed to dogs or tossed into the refuse. While peasants rioted for bark loaves outside city walls, nobles casually wasted bread that could have kept dozens alive. Another indulgence was trencher bread. Instead of plates, nobles dined on thick slabs of bread used as edible serving dishes. These trenchers absorbed meat juices, sauces, and grease throughout the meal. At the end of the feast, the soggy trenchers were handed to servants, beggars, or even tossed into ditches. Archaeological finds near castles have uncovered piles of discarded trencher bread, still blackened with grease centuries later. The irony was cruel. The nobility ate their fill of meat and spice while the poor gnawed at the leftovers, bread transformed into garbage after serving as a plate. Bread also served political theatre. Monarchs staged ceremonial distributions of loaves to their subjects, especially during coronations or major feasts. These gifts were meant to demonstrate generosity, though the loaves given to commoners were often coarse compared to the refined bread kept at the royal table. Chronicles of the French court describe enormous loaves, sometimes weighing several pounds, baked solely for display and paraded through the hall. To hold a royal loaf was to witness the hierarchy of society baked into a single crust. Yet noble bread was not free from risk. Fine white flour spoiled more quickly than coarse rye, and without refrigeration mould crept in within days. Rich households kept stores of grain in vast granaries, where rats feasted in secret. Servants worked constantly to sift out droppings and insects, but the contamination was impossible to prevent. Even kings sometimes bit into loaves crawling with unseen guests. The difference was that they had doctors and priests on hand to explain it away as imbalance of humours or divine testing, while peasants were left to convulse in silence. The association of bread with power reached strange extremes. In some courts, bakers themselves were treated as prized retainers, protected by the household as if they were smiths or physicians. A skilled baker was essential to a lord's reputation, since guests would judge status by the whiteness and softness of the loaves served. To fail in this duty could mean dismissal, but to succeed ensured steady patronage. Bread was politics on the plate, a visible reminder of privilege every time the knife sliced through a manchet loaf. Picture yourself sitting in a great hall. The long table glows with candlelight, trenchers steaming, gilded loaves piled like treasure. Servants move silently, cutting slices of white bread for the lords while the scraps are pushed to the edges for you. You chew the soggy crust of a discarded trencher, swallowing grease and crumbs, and realise that even within the same hall bread divides you. For the noble, it is art. For you, it is survival. But even as nobles flaunted their wealth through bread, another class of people used loaves for entirely different purposes. In hospitals, monasteries and almshouses, bread became medicine, charity, and sometimes punishment. It was soaked in wine to heal wounds, crumbled into poultices, or handed out to the poor as alms. And in those spaces the line between nourishment and harm grew even stranger. Step away from the glittering tables of the nobility and into the hushed halls of a medieval hospital, and bread suddenly takes on an entirely different identity. Here it is not a feast, but a cure, not a symbol of status, but a fragile attempt at healing. Medieval physicians, who had only the vaguest grasp of germs or nutrition, reached for bread as their most versatile tool. Crumble it into wine, soak it in vinegar, mash it with herbs, and suddenly you had a poultice for wounds or a salve for fevers. Bread was medicine by default because it was everywhere, because it was soft, and because no one had invented aspirin. One of the most common remedies was bread soaked in wine, pressed against cuts and abscesses to draw out bad humours. Doctors believed the bread absorbed poison and disease the way it absorbed gravy at the dinner table. In reality, wine sometimes acted as a weak antiseptic, while the bread itself became a warm, moist incubator for more infection. Patients walked away believing they'd been healed by a divine miracle, but many likely carried away new bacteria in the bandages. Surgeons also used chewed bread to plug wounds, spitting it directly into gashes as if saliva were part of the cure. The irony of using rotten teeth to clean an injury did not occur to anyone. Bread was also given internally as a medicinal treatment. Crumbs soaked in milk were fed to patients with stomach ailments, the soft paste believed to soothe internal irritation. Bread boiled with herbs became a broth for fevers, though it often did little more than provide soggy starch. In extreme cases, bread mixed with ground pearls, gold dust, or spices was prescribed for the wealthy, an absurd concoction that only ensured your body expelled expensive ingredients as waste. The poor meanwhile received bark bread or acorn loaves in the name of treatment, remedies indistinguishable from famine rations. Monasteries turned bread into both charity and discipline. Alms loaves were handed out daily to the poor at monastery gates, dense and dark, often made from the roughest flour available. These loaves became lifelines for entire communities, especially during famine, yet they were also tokens of control. To receive bread meant submission to the church, proof of humility before God. Inside the cloister, monks ate bread as penance, deliberately coarse loaves baked without seasoning or fat, the harder the better. A soft crumb was indulgence, a crust that broke your teeth was holiness. Hospitals for the poor distributed what were known as blessed loaves, bread consecrated and believed to heal through divine grace. Patients clutched them like relics, nibbling slowly, even though the bread itself was often moldy. Spoilage in these institutions was rampant. Grain stored in damp conditions quickly sprouted fungus, and bread left for days became breeding grounds for disease. Yet the act of eating holy bread was considered part of the cure, so people consumed contaminated loaves believing it would shorten their suffering. In many cases it probably shortened their lives. Bread was also punishment. In monasteries, wrongdoers were sentenced to a diet of bread and water, a supposedly penitential regime that was also nutritionally disastrous. Surviving on bread alone meant constant fatigue, vitamin deficiency and digestive problems. Chroniclers describe monks who wasted away under such diets, their bodies literally hollowed by the very food that was meant to sustain them. In prisons, the same punishment applied. Inmates survived on thin loaves baked with the cheapest flour, sometimes mixed with bran and sawdust. Their bellies filled, but their strength eroded. Bread here was not life, but slow execution. In hospitals, bread even crept into diagnosis. Physicians used bread to test urine, soaking crumbs in a sample to examine the results. Sweet urine made the bread sticky, an early observation of what we now recognize as diabetes. Bitter urine crumbled the loaf, a sign of imbalance in the humours. Patients probably wondered why their physician was dunking food into their bodily fluids. But in a world without microscopes, Bread became a crude laboratory tool. The same staple that filled your stomach at breakfast now judged the contents of your bladder by lunch. Charity loaves carried their own dangers. Distributed in public squares, they were often fought over by crowds of the desperate. Riots broke out over free bread, with people trampling each other for a crust. In some towns, charity distributions had to be guarded by soldiers to prevent chaos. Bakers complained of being forced to provide free loaves for feast days, their profits slashed in the name of public goodwill. And yet, these loaves were not always safe. Made quickly and cheaply, they were more likely to harbour mould, pests, or adulterants. The poor ate them gratefully, but the act of charity sometimes delivered sickness alongside salvation. Picture yourself in one of these hospitals, lying on a straw bed, fevered and weak. A monk brings a cup of bread soaked in sour wine, presses it to your lips and tells you it will heal your spirit. The liquid burns your throat, the crumbs stick in your teeth, and you wonder if you're drinking medicine or simply yesterday's leftovers. At your bedside sits another patient clutching a mould-flecked loaf, convinced it will save him from death. The room smells of sweat, mildew, and stale bread. This is medieval healthcare, where every cure tastes like crust and every treatment begins with crumbs. And as you watch the monk move on to the next patient, bread in one hand and a flask of wine in the other, you realise that in the Middle Ages the line between food, medicine, and punishment blurred until they became the same thing. Loaves that fed the body could just as easily poison it, heal it, or humiliate it. And beyond the hospitals and monasteries, bread carried yet another role, becoming the stage for scandal, fraud, and lawsuits that reached all the way into the courts of kings. From the monastery infirmary where bread doubled as a bandage, you step into the echoing halls of medieval courts, where loaves were no longer food or cure but legal evidence. Few things in Europe provoked lawsuits more reliably than bread. It was too essential, too unstable, and too easily corrupted to escape the grasp of lawyers, judges, and angry citizens. The courtroom table often held not scrolls or contracts, but a suspicious loaf brought in like a star witness, its floury crust inspected as if it could speak for itself. The assize of bread and ale, first established in England in the 13th century, was meant to regulate loaves with mathematical precision. A pound of wheat at a set price was supposed to produce a loaf of a specific weight, with fines and punishments for bakers who cheated. In theory, it was elegant, almost scientific. In practice, it was chaos. Grain prices fluctuated weekly, sometimes daily, and bakers struggled to keep up. Inspectors weighed loaves with scales that were often as corrupt as the bakers themselves. A loaf that was perfectly legal one week could be criminal the next. Bakers found themselves hauled into court constantly, accused of short weight, adulteration, or fraud. These trials were not small affairs. Crowds gathered to see a baker accused, shouting insults as the judge demanded the loaf be weighed in front of everyone. Chroniclers describe bakers sweating under the eyes of their neighbours, praying the loaf did not tip the scale short. If it did, the punishments were brutal. Some were fined, others imprisoned, and the most notorious were paraded with their fraudulent loaves around their necks. In Paris, records show bakers forced to march through the city holding underweight bread above their heads, a scarlet letter baked into crust. But sometimes the cases took stranger turns. In a few towns, customers sued bakers for illness, claiming chalk-filled loaves had poisoned entire families. With no medical proof, the court often relied on community testimony. If enough neighbours swore the bread made them vomit, the baker was condemned. Other times, bread itself was subjected to trial by ordeal. A disputed loaf might be thrown into water to see if it floated, the outcome interpreted as guilt or innocence. Bread could even be sworn upon like a holy relic, a bizarre inversion where the object of fraud became the instrument of justice. Legal documents from Bologna, Paris, and London are filled with cases where bakers tried to defend themselves. Some argued the flour was faulty from the mill, that rats had eaten part of the loaf before inspection, or that their apprentices had made mistakes. judges were rarely sympathetic, bread was too central to risk leniency. A dishonest butcher might cheat one family. A dishonest baker could cheat the entire town in a single day. The law made examples of them not because they were the worst criminals, but because they were the most visible. Bread riots often spilled into the courts as well. In years of famine, citizens stormed bakeries, looting loaves and demanding justice. Authorities responded by staging public trials of bakers accused of hoarding flour or selling adulterated bread. The spectacle was meant to calm the mob, to show that order still ruled. Yet often these trials only inflamed anger. If the punishment seemed too light, riots grew worse. Bread was not only food, it was politics, and every verdict carried consequences far beyond the oven. One of the most famous scandals unfolded in Paris in the 14th century, when dozens of bakers were accused of systematically shortchanging customers. The court declared it a conspiracy against the city. Bakers were dragged into the streets, their shops shuttered, their loaves confiscated. Chroniclers describe piles of bread burned in bonfires as if destroying them could purify the market. The accused bakers were whipped, fined, and in some cases exiled, their ovens dismantled as symbols of disgrace. For the citizens who watched, it was less about justice and more about theatre. The bread was gone, but so was their trust. Even kings weighed in on bread disputes. Royal proclamations ordered strict enforcement of assizes, sometimes accompanied by public displays of weighing loaves in the marketplace. The symbolism was clear. The king protected his people's stomachs, even if only in ceremony. Behind the scenes, lords often manipulated grain supplies for profit, selling flour at inflated prices to the very bakers they punished. The courts provided spectacle, but the corruption was baked deep into the system. Picture yourself in one of these courtrooms. The judge sits on a high bench, the crowd murmurs, and in the centre lies the accused loaf, its crust cracked, its weight uncertain. The baker protests his innocence, but the scale tips against him. The gavel falls, and you watch as he's dragged outside, forced to carry his fraudulent bread through the streets. Children jeer, dogs snap at his heels, and neighbours whisper that they had always suspected his loaves tasted of plaster. The punishment is as much about shame as it is about law, and yet even as bakers suffered in courts, others found ways to thrive in the shadows. Secret markets of bread sprang up in alleys, loaves sold without inspection, flour traded under the table. These underground economies fed cities when official channels collapsed, and though dangerous, they were often the only source of food for the desperate. It was here, in the dim back streets, that bread revealed its next face. Black market loaves, smuggled, stolen, and sometimes poisoned, the underbelly of medieval survival. Step out of the courtroom, past the baker still dripping from his dunking chair, and you will find that the real bread market is not in the square but in the alley. Official loaves might be weighed and measured under the assize, but the city's stomach did not stop at regulations. Behind shuttered doors and beneath crooked roofs, black market bread changed hands. It was illegal, dangerous, and often the only way anyone could eat. Grain was the lifeblood of the medieval economy, and controlling it meant controlling people. Lords claimed rights over mills, cities passed laws about baking, and inspectors prowled the streets with scales. But shortages made the system crack. When famine struck, when armies occupied fields, or when the harvest rotted, people turned to smugglers. Men hauled sacks of wheat at night across borders, women baked loaves in hidden ovens, children carried crusts wrapped in cloth to sell in markets. The black market was not a fringe, it was the backbone of survival whenever official supplies collapsed. Records from London describe bakers accused of night baking, operating ovens outside guild hours to avoid oversight. Authorities feared these loaves, not because they were worse, but because they evaded taxes and inspections. A black market loaf might weigh more, taste fresher, and cost less. Yet if caught, the punishment was severe. Illegal bakers could have their ovens destroyed, their flour confiscated, even their hands mutilated to ensure they never needed dough again. Still, the ovens kept glowing at night, smoke curling from chimneys as people risked everything for bread. In times of siege, black market bread became the only currency that mattered. Smugglers crawled through tunnels and slipped past guards, carrying sacks of flour or half-baked loaves into starving cities. Chronicles of the Siege of Paris in 1429 describe smugglers caught with bread sewn into their clothes, loaves strapped to their legs like armour. They were executed for treason, their bodies displayed as warnings. Yet others followed, because in a city where people chewed leather and bark, a single loaf fetched the value of gold. The church condemned black market bread as sinful, branding it dishonest and unblessed. Yet monasteries quietly participated, trading loaves on feast days when demand spiked. Nobles too, despite laws, often turned a blind eye when their own households bought contraband flour. Hypocrisy fed as many mouths as morality. The official line was punishment, but the practical line was profit. Black market bread was not always safer. Without inspections, bakers used whatever they could find. Loaves mixed with bean flour, sawdust or ground weeds often circulated in hidden stalls. In one case recorded in Bologna, inspectors raided a cellar bakery and discovered loaves made with plaster and clay, baked so dense they clinked like stone when dropped. Buyers ate them anyway, because a stone loaf still beat an empty stomach. Smuggling grain was an art. Men hollowed out barrels and filled them with wheat under layers of wine. Others packed grain into coffins to carry it past checkpoints disguised as funerals. Merchants bribed guards with loaves hot from the oven, trading calories for clemency. Even soldiers sworn to enforce the law dipped into smuggling. Armies on campaign often lost sacks of grain that miraculously reappeared in civilian markets at inflated prices. The black market was not only survival, it was opportunism. Picture yourself in one of these alleys. A woman hands you a loaf still warm, its crust cracked but inviting. You know it was baked in a hidden oven, the flour likely stolen, the baker risking ruin. You bite into it anyway, the taste richer than the chalky legal loaves you're used to. But even as you chew, you hear shouts at the end of the street. Inspectors are raiding, men are running, and you tuck the loaf under your cloak like contraband. In this world, bread is not just food, it is evidence, guilt, and salvation rolled into one. Black market bread shaped politics as much as hunger. Authorities cracked down hard after riots, hoping to restore trust. Yet every crackdown only bred more resistance. Loaves disappeared into underground channels, ovens sprouted in barns and cellars, and the law became a game of cat and mouse. Bread was always moving, always shifting hands, always one step ahead of authority. And the longer you walk through these alleys, the clearer it becomes that bread in the Middle Ages was never simply baked and eaten. It was regulated, stolen, smuggled, blessed, cursed, and weaponized. And while the alleys are full of secret ovens, the roads beyond the city reveal another danger, where bread travelled not quietly in sacks, but in caravans and convoys, guarded by soldiers and stalked by bandits, each crust a prize worth killing for. Beyond the alleys where secret loaves change hands, you find the dirt roads that connect one town to another. Along them rumbles the lifeline of the medieval world, carts creaking under sacks of grain, baskets of bread, and barrels of flour. These were not quaint deliveries, they were convoys, guarded by soldiers with spears and crossbows because bread was too valuable to leave unprotected. A single wagon held enough grain to feed a village for weeks, and in an age when hunger was constant, every convoy was a moving target. Merchants who moved bread and flour became almost like generals of their own campaigns. They had to plan routes around rivers, pay tolls to lords for passage, and hire guards to fend off thieves. Bandits stalked roads precisely because they knew food was worth more than gold. Chronicles describe entire convoys ambushed, their guards slaughtered, the grain scattered or carried off in sacks by peasants hiding in the woods. In war, enemy soldiers did the same thing, capturing food supplies not just to feed themselves but to starve the people they robbed. A cart of bread was both dinner and weapon, and every wheel that broke or ox that stumbled risked catastrophe. The condition of these convoys made the food worse before it even reached its destination. Grain spilled into mud, mixed with horse droppings, or grew mould from damp weather. Sacks often burst open, so merchants patched them with anything they had, including rags soaked with sweat. By the time the flour was baked, it carried more than grain. It carried the imprint of every mile travelled. Travellers often complained that bread bought from convoys tasted faintly of manure or mildew, yet they ate it without hesitation because it was all they could get. When armies marched, their entire strategy hinged on bread. Supply wagons stretched for miles, creaking behind soldiers who marched ahead. A hungry army was a defeated army, and commanders obsessed over their bread supply. The Romans before had mastered it with their rations, and medieval rulers tried to copy, though often with less success. If the convoys were delayed by mud, weather or raids, soldiers went days without rations. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War are filled with accounts of troops abandoning campaigns because the bread supply failed. Battles were not won by swords alone, but by whether a convoy of carts managed to arrive intact. And sometimes the soldiers themselves became the thieves. Paid late or not at all, many took to raiding the very convoys meant for them. Reports survive of armies tearing open their own wagons in mutiny, grabbing loaves by the handful, eating half-baked dough straight from sacks. Commanders punished the guilty, but hunger always returned. A soldier who had marched all day on a stomach filled with nothing but sour ale was not likely to stand guard politely while wagons rattled by full of bread. Merchants invented creative ways to hide their supplies. Some disguised carts of grain under piles of hay or manure, reasoning that bandits were less likely to dig through filth. Others travelled at night, baking bread in secret and loading loaves before dawn. In some towns, bakers hid fresh loaves in barrels of salted fish, the smell disguising their prize. Yet none of these tricks worked forever. Bread left the city as wealth and returned as rumour, and every hungry mouth along the road wanted a piece. Imagine walking alongside one of these convoys. The oxen plod through mud, the soldiers trudge in armour, and behind them stretches wagon after wagon filled with the only thing that matters. The wheels creak, the guards squint at the trees, and you realise that every cart is both salvation and bait. Somewhere ahead lies a village desperate for these loaves. Somewhere in the woods lies a band of peasants waiting to steal them. And between the two, the bread itself deteriorates, absorbing the journey like a sponge, becoming less food and more memory of hardship. Convoys became such a symbol of life that chroniclers often noted their destruction with more detail than the battles themselves. When food trains burned, armies crumbled. In some cases, cities starved not because of famine, but because the bread meant for them never arrived. To attack a convoy was to strike at the heart of a people, a silent battle fought not with swords, but with crusts. And so the bread keeps rolling, guarded by soldiers, prayed over by towns, stalked by thieves, and spoiled by distance. But the moment it reaches its destination, another question arises, one even more dangerous than the roads themselves. For once the loaves are baked and laid on the table, the people who eat them face an invisible enemy, a parasite so small it cannot be seen, yet capable of turning bread into a poison that twists minds and scorches flesh. The carts finally reach their destination. The ovens roar and loaves are pulled fresh from the fire. But inside some of them lies an enemy no soldier can guard against. On the surface the bread looks ordinary, a little darker perhaps, a little bitter in smell. But hunger swallows hesitation. What the eye cannot see is ergot, the black spiky fungus that clings to rye in damp fields. Bake it into bread and you're not feeding a town, you're dosing it with poison. The effects were so dramatic they earned their own name, St. Anthony's Fire. People who ate ergot-infected bread often felt as if their skin was burning, as if invisible flames licked their bodies. Limbs convulsed, muscles seized, and hallucinations turned entire villages into nightmare theatres. chroniclers describe men and women writhing in the streets, their hands clawing the air, their faces contorted as if possessed. Some saw visions of demons, others claimed to hear voices, still others danced uncontrollably until they collapsed. In a world without microscopes or chemistry, it could only be explained as the devil's work. The outbreaks were not small. In 944, a mass poisoning in France killed as many as 40,000 people. The victims wasted away with gangrenous limbs, fingers blackening and falling off, feet rotting until they had to be amputated. Others survived but were left maimed, missing arms or legs consumed by the disease. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony built hospitals to care for these victims, hence the name St. Anthony's Fire. The irony was brutal. People who came seeking healing were often fed bread that contained the same fungus that had crippled them in the first place. Ergot poisoning came in two forms. One was convulsive, twisting the body into spasms, filling the mind with hallucinations so vivid that people believed they were cursed. The other was gangrenous, slowly starving the extremities of blood until they blackened and dropped off. To eat ergot bread was to play a game of chance. One bite might give you visions of angels, the next might rot your feet. Medieval villagers did not understand alkaloids, but they understood terror, and bread became both sustenance and threat with every swallow. The social consequences were enormous. Communities already primed to see the devil in every shadow often blamed outbreaks on witches. When entire families convulsed at the table or ran screaming into the night with visions, suspicion fell on outsiders, old women, or anyone unlucky enough to live near the field where the rye grew. Historians now suspect that some witch trials in Europe were sparked not by sorcery, but by ergot poisoning. Bread, in this sense, literally fed the fire of persecution. Even soldiers were not safe. Campaigns that relied heavily on rye sometimes marched straight into outbreaks of convulsions. Armies ate the same mouldy supplies day after day, and chroniclers record whole groups of soldiers collapsing, raving, or unable to fight. Imagine an army meant to storm a fortress suddenly doubled over in spasms, hallucinating devils on the battlefield. Commanders blamed treason, curses, or divine punishment. But the true culprit was the same loaf they had trusted to fuel their march. The hallucinations could be bizarrely specific. Victims reported their skin crawling with insects, their bodies stretched or shrunken, their limbs turned into animals. Some danced wildly, unable to stop moving, an eerie prelude to the dancing plagues that swept Europe in later centuries. Bread became a stage for visions that blurred the line between sickness and possession, between famine and frenzy. Even when people recognized the danger, they were helpless. Grain was too precious to throw away. If a harvest showed signs of ergot, people still ground it into flour rather than starve. Peasants could not afford to waste rye, even if it meant sickness. Some tried to pick out the black kernels by hand, but many escaped notice. By the time the bread left the oven, it was impossible to tell the safe loaf from the deadly one. Picture yourself sitting at a long table in a village hall. A loaf of rye bread is broken and passed around. You take a piece, bite, and swallow. Hours later, your fingers tingle, your stomach knots, and your vision swims. The firelight blurs into monstrous shapes. Your body jerks against your will, and the crowd around you erupts into screams as others collapse. What began as a communal meal has turned into a mass convulsion, and the loaf that was supposed to unite the village has torn it apart. And yet, not all ergot outbreaks ended in despair. Some communities noticed that grazing animals avoided infected rye, and gradually people learned to discard the blackened grains. Others relied more heavily on wheat or barley when they could afford it, grains less prone to infestation. Over centuries knowledge grew, but in the Middle Ages the fungus remained a mystery, an invisible curse baked into daily life. What is remarkable is how close this danger came to shaping history itself. Some scholars argue that ergot poisoning influenced events as large as peasant uprisings, or the Salem witch trials centuries later. Bread was not just a backdrop to history, it was an actor in it, fueling madness and fear in equal measure. And as ergot lingered in the fields, it forced people to wonder what other poisons might be hiding in their food, what unseen skeletons lay beneath the crust of every loaf. And as the hallucinations fade, you stagger back toward the ovens, aware that bread can kill in silence or in spectacle. But the fungus was not the only contaminant. Beyond natural poison, there were human hands mixing filth into flour, grinding in powders, and selling loaves doctored with whatever made them cheaper. The story of bread is never just about harvests. It is about the fraud baked deliberately into the dough. When the fungus did not get you, the baker's hand sometimes did. For in the Middle Ages, bread was not only corrupted by accident, but by design. Flour was expensive, mouths were many, and profit demanded shortcuts. So into the dough went whatever stretched the grain further. White bread was prized above all, a symbol of purity and wealth, but few could afford the real thing. To keep customers happy and margins intact, bakers resorted to powders that imitated whiteness, powders that belonged more in a quarry than an oven. Chalk was the most common impostor. Ground fine and sifted into flour, it brightened dough and produced loaves that looked pure even when the grain was coarse. Customers believed they were eating the bread of lords when in reality they were gnawing on plaster. The health effects were obvious, though poorly understood. Chalk in bread wore down teeth, upset stomachs, and in large amounts caused serious illness. Yet it was so widespread that inspectors frequently found entire bakeries filled with chalk sacks, stored alongside grain. But chalk was far from the worst. Some bakers mixed sand into their dough, reasoning that it added weight and crunch without costing a coin. The unfortunate customer discovered this with every chew, their teeth grinding against grit. Over time, sand-filled bread literally destroyed mouths. Archaeologists examining medieval skeletons often find teeth ground down to stumps, worn flat as if by sandpaper. Bread itself, ironically, was the culprit, slowly erasing enamel with every meal. Then there was sawdust. In times of famine or greed, bakers stretched flour with ground wood, creating loaves that were dry, pale, and strangely light. Sawdust bread provided bulk without nourishment, filling the belly while starving the body. Soldiers on campaign sometimes received rations baked with this trick, their commanders hoping to keep them marching a little longer on empty calories. Diaries describe the bread as bitter and dry, crumbs clinging to the mouth like dust. Eating sawdust was better than nothing, but only just. Bone dust carried both symbolism and horror. Ground from animal remains and sometimes even human ones, it was mixed into dough as a filler. The gritty powder added calcium, though not in any way medieval eaters would have welcomed if they had known the source. Chroniclers hint at bakeries where bones from graveyards were pilfered and sold to mills, then sifted into flour without acknowledgement. To eat bread laced with bone was to consume the literal dead, to take skeletons into your body disguised as food. These adulterations were not always the work of lone villains. Entire economies relied on them. Millers often sold flour already cut with chalk or bran, and bakers simply continued the fraud. Customers rarely had the means to test their bread. They judged by colour and weight, and if the loaf looked pale and felt heavy, it was accepted. Inspectors tried to catch offenders, but corruption and bribes made enforcement weak. In practice, most people ate adulterated bread regularly, their daily staple always tinged with hidden grit. Soldiers bore the brunt of this trickery. Armies needed bulk rations, and commanders bought in massive quantities from the cheapest suppliers. The result was loaves padded with everything from ground beans to sawdust. Soldiers joked bitterly that their teeth were weapons, honed by chewing bread harder than their own armour. Marching on such loaves left them weak, sickly, and often furious. An army with bad bread was an army primed for mutiny. Even nobles were not entirely safe. While their loaves were finer, the whiteness was often achieved through adulteration rather than pure flour. Guests at banquets might marvel at the glowing white manchets served before them, unaware that the secret ingredient was ground gypsum. Behind the splendour of gold-leafed loaves lay the same fraud that plagued peasants. Bread as status symbol was still bread as deception. Picture yourself tearing into one of these loaves. The crust cracks, a puff of powder rises, and grit crunches between your teeth. At first you think it is coarse flour, but soon you realise the taste is bitter, the texture unnatural. You chew anyway, because hunger does not care about flavour. By the end of the meal, your jaw aches, your stomach feels heavy, and you have swallowed more quarry dust than grain. This was the daily reality of bread in a world where appearance mattered more than safety. The punishments for adulteration, when enforced, were theatrical. Bakers caught mixing chalk or sawdust might be paraded through town with fraudulent loaves hung around their necks. In some cases, they were forced to eat their own bread in front of jeering crowds. Yet for every baker punished, dozens continued the practice in secret. Fraud was too profitable, enforcement too inconsistent, and hunger too desperate to stop the cycle. Adulterated bread left marks that lasted beyond the meal. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries show teeth worn flat, jaws deformed from years of grinding against grit. Stomachs scarred from indigestible fillers tell the same story. Bread, the supposed staff of life, was slowly killing those who depended on it, and yet people ate it daily, unable to choose otherwise. And as you brush the chalk dust from your lips, you realise bread's corruption did not end in the bakery. Once baked, loaves moved into kitchens where they became ingredients in stews, sauces, and even utensils, each step adding new layers of danger. The table itself became another battlefield, where bread absorbed meat juices, mould and filth, then returned to hungry mouths under the guise of nourishment. The loaf you chew is filled with chalk and grit, but the deception does not end once it leaves the oven. At the medieval table, bread was not only food, it was plate, napkin, and sponge all in one. Few things reveal the oddities of dining culture more clearly than the humble trencher. A thick slice of bread placed in front of you not to be eaten at first, but to serve as your dish. Onto this edible slab went meats, stews, and sauces, soaking into the crumb until the bread itself became saturated with grease. At the end of the meal, the trencher was either eaten by servants or tossed to beggars waiting outside. The lord feasted on venison, the peasant licked the juices out of stale bread, and everyone agreed this was perfectly normal. Trenchers were not designed for hygiene. By the end of a banquet they were sodden, black with gravy, and often crawling with the flies that swarmed medieval halls. Nobles rarely touched them, instead discarding them to dogs or the poor. Servants fought over them because the soaked bread carried the flavour of the feast even if it contained little meat. To live on trenchers was to survive on hand-me-down grease, the nutritional equivalent of licking the inside of someone else's cooking pot. Yet for many peasants this was the only taste of noble food they ever had. The use of bread as utensil did not stop with trenchers. Diners wiped their hands on chunks of bread, using them as edible napkins. Greasy fingers left stains in the crumb, which was then tossed away or fed to animals. Bread also acted as spoon, used to scoop stews and sauces, then discarded when it became too soggy to hold. Archaeologists excavating medieval sites often find layers of discarded bread hardened into crusts of history, proof of meals where bread served as both tool and trash. Leftovers became another hazard. Bread spoiled quickly, turning hard within days and mouldy soon after, yet nothing was wasted. Mouldy bread was scraped, re-soaked in ale, or boiled into pottages. The logic was simple: better to eat fungus than starve. Unfortunately, this logic also meant exposure to toxins. Green and black moulds flourished in damp storage, and though not all were lethal, some carried harmful spores. Chroniclers describe villagers falling ill after eating bread stewed too long in broth, a likely result of mould breaking down into the meal. For soldiers, stale bread was routine, softened in wine or beer until it became edible sludge. It filled the belly but brought dysentery and infection with it. Nobles disguise stale bread with sugar, honey or spices, turning it into sweet puddings that masked its age. Recipes survived for dishes where old bread was crumbled, boiled and transformed into spiced cakes. These dishes became delicacies, celebrated in cookbooks, yet their origin was simply the need to recycle what would otherwise rot. To eat a fine bread pudding in a lord's hall was to taste luxury built on the skeleton of spoiled loaves. Trenchers carried social symbolism as much as sustenance. To receive a fresh trencher at the start of a meal marked you as important, while lesser guests were served loaves already stale. By the end of a banquet, discarded trenchers piled up by the doors, carried off to almshouses or thrown to beggars who clustered like scavengers. Bread distributed this way was seen as charity, but it was also a stark reminder of inequality. The rich dined on meat and spice, the poor gnawed on bread soaked with drippings and crumbs. Even in monasteries, trenchers had a role. Monks were often served meals on thick slabs of bread that absorbed broth and vegetables. These bread plates were later fed to the poor as alms, part of the church's duty to charity. Yet the loaves themselves were already half rotten by the time they reached their final consumers. The sanctity of almsgiving did little to change the fact that mould was baked into the system. Picture yourself at a feast. Before you lies a trencher, dark bread cut into a square slab. Onto it, servants heap roasted pork, stewed onions, and thick sauces. You eat with your hands, tearing chunks of meat and wiping your fingers on the bread beneath. The trencher grows soft, collapsing under the grease. By the time you finish, it is a dripping sponge of fat and juice. A servant takes it from you, carries it outside and hands it to a beggar. The beggar devours it eagerly, grease running down his chin. For him, this is a meal. For you, it was nothing more than a plate. The afterlife of trenchers also fed armies. Surplus from banquets was sometimes collected and carted to soldiers, who ate the greasy slabs with gratitude. To march on trenchers was to march on reheated scraps, bread that had soaked in sauce for days before reaching the camp. Spoilage was rampant. Insects thrived in the loaves, and yet soldiers ate them because nothing went to waste in war. The noble feast thus extended its shadow into the battlefield, its leftovers fueling campaigns as much as gold and steel. The culture of bread as utensil left a deeper mark than most realise. It blurred the line between food and object, between nourishment and trash. Bread was not just eaten, it was used, discarded, recycled, and eaten again. Each stage added new risks, new layers of filth, new chances for disease, and yet the system endured, because no other material was as abundant or as disposable. Wood rotted, pottery shattered, but bread could always be baked anew. And as you watch the last trenchers carried off into the dark, you realise that the story of bread is not only about what went into the oven, but what happened after it left the table. In taverns and alehouses, bread took on another role entirely, soaked in drink, gambled in games, and sometimes used as currency in wagers. The loaf was not just food, not just plate, but coin, token, and entertainment, embedding itself into every part of daily life. When the banquet halls emptied and the trenchers went cold, another kind of bread lived on in the taverns and alehouses. Here the loaf was not sacred or ceremonial, it was practical, cheap, and usually stale. Bread was the backbone of tavern culture, piled in baskets on wooden tables sticky with spilled ale, served as filler to stretch out drinks and soak up alcohol. If you staggered into a tavern after a long day in the fields or a march with your regiment, bread was the first thing slapped down in front of you, not because it was good, but because it was necessary. Tavern bread was rarely fresh. Bakers sold their leftovers to alehouses, who resold them as if nothing had changed. Hard loaves were dunked into pitchers of ale until they softened, transforming from inedible bricks into soggy lumps that filled the stomach quickly. This practice even earned a name: sop. To sop bread in drink was to make it edible, and from this habit comes the very word supper. Imagine dipping bread so stale it could chip a tooth into ale so weak it tasted like watery porridge, then calling it dinner. That was medieval pub grub. Soldiers on campaign practically lived on esops. Ale was safer to drink than water, and stale bread was cheaper than meat. Combined, they formed a meal that was both filling and mildly intoxicating. Armies often rationed bread and ale together, knowing the mixture dulled hunger and softened morale. The downside was obvious. Too much ale-sodden bread left men bloated, sluggish and stumbling. Commanders worried less about enemy arrows than about soldiers too drunk to hold formation, because their dinner had doubled as their bar tab. Bread also became tavern currency. In poorer quarters, coins were scarce, and a loaf could stand in as payment for drinks, favours or wages. Gambling dens saw men betting loaves instead of silver, entire tables staked on rounds of dice. Winners walked home with baskets of bread, losers slunk into the streets hungry. Chroniclers described taverns where bread tokens circulated like chips, each crust worth a sip of ale or a turn at cards. Bread was not just food, it was coin, slipping between hands as quickly as drink. The quality of tavern bread was legendary in its mediocrity. It was often cut with bran, peas or anything cheap, baked quickly in smoky ovens. The loaves tasted of ash and ale, sometimes of mould, and often carried weevils. Patrons joked about biting into bread that stared back at them, yet they ate it anyway. Hunger dulled standards, and the tavern was where no one asked questions. If the bread was grey with mould, you simply scraped it off. If the crust was rock hard, you soaked it longer in ale. The tavern motto was simple: everything becomes edible if you're drunk enough. Yet tavern bread also carried danger. Weakened ale could not always kill the bacteria lurking in stale loaves. Dysentery spread easily among patrons who shared cups, sops and spoons. A single bad loaf could sicken half a tavern in one night. Still, the practice continued because it was tradition, and tradition meant never questioning why your food made you ill. Alehouses served bread not to nourish, but to ensure people kept drinking. A belly full of bread soaked in weak ale guaranteed customers stayed longer and bought more rounds. Picture yourself in one of these alehouses. The air is thick with smoke and sweat, the tables littered with crumbs. A pitcher of ale sits before you, weak and sour, and into it you dunk your hunk of bread. It collapses into a paste, dripping down your chin as you slurp it. Around you, soldiers gamble with loaves, peasants argue over scraps, and in the corner a minstrel sings of kings and saints to an audience too drunk to notice. The bread in your hand is food, drink, money and entertainment all at once. Taverns also served trenchers piled with stews, the bread soaking up juices until it was almost soup. Patrons often ate these with fingers, tearing off sodden pieces and passing them around. Germs spread from hand to hand, yet no one cared. The ale dulled suspicion, and the bread kept bellies full. In some towns, taverns even baked their own loaves, cutting costs but raising risks. Without proper ovens or skill, these loaves came out undercooked or burned, dense in the middle and brittle at the edges. Still, patrons lined up for them because tavern bread was cheap and plentiful. Bread in alehouses blurred into ritual. Some towns had customs where newlyweds soaked bread in ale and fed it to each other in front of the crowd, a gesture of unity as much as of indigestion. Other times, bread served as symbolic fines, tossed at drunkards or gamblers who lost too loudly. Soldiers on leave often remembered their tavern bread more vividly than their rations. For them, the taste of stale crust dunked in sour ale was the flavour of camaraderie, filth, and fleeting joy before the next campaign. And as you stagger out of the tavern into the night, belly heavy with ale-soaked crust, you realise that bread has followed you from battlefield to banquet, from monastery to marketplace, from courtroom to alehouse. Yet its story does not stop there. In prisons, dungeons, and punishment cells, bread became something darker still, stripped of even the small comforts of grease and ale, reduced to the barest form of survival. And that's where we'll leave you for tonight. If you enjoyed this little journey through mouldy loaves and medieval misery, let me know down in the comments which historical disaster you'd like me to ruin your appetite with next. And if listening to centuries of human suffering wrapped in stale bread helps you drift off to sleep, go ahead and check out my other videos. There's plenty more history where this indigestion came from.